and welcome to this week's movie about how to use the pen tool. Last week we worked with primitive shapes and found out there's a lot you can do with them, but there are times when you just have to draw it yourself to get what you want. These primitives just can't be finagled into the exact shape you want. Now, there's a couple of ways to draw with Illustrator, and one of them is the paintbrush tool. And you can, with your mouse, or better yet, if you have a pressure stylus connected to your computer, this can be programmed to respond to the pressure of your stylus. But you can just sort of draw naturally, and I'll just draw out a shape. And you see it was sort of rough, and then Illustrator smoothed it out a little bit. And what Illustrator did was basically trace out my shape and put a bunch of points along this line to describe the shape I drew. Drawing with a mouse is a bit like drawing with a potato, so it can be hard if you don't have a stylus. It can be hard to control the shape you're coming up with. We're also looking at a new kind of path, which is an open path. All the paths that we worked with last week, I could just draw out an ellipse, are closed in that this path has no beginning or end. It's just a circle. It feeds into itself. And all of these primitive shapes that we could work with, all of those are closed paths. But this path is open. Now, you might think you can't give a fill to a closed path, but in fact you can. Let me just choose the fill, and I'll select red. And what Illustrator does is it just makes a straight line between one end of the path and the other. So it is an open path, but it can have a fill. That did not used to be true in Illustrator a long time ago, but it's been true for a while. I think I'm going to get rid of that fill though. And then hiding behind the brush tool by default, although it was up when I opened it, is the blob brush tool. And if we could just draw out a shape like this, it looks pretty indistinguishable from the one below it. But the difference is that, let me select my white arrow, my direct select, and let's just zoom in on that. And we can see that this is in fact now a closed path. There are points on both sides. It's just a very skinny closed path. And again, let's just pick one of those points, and we can make it a little bit wider in places if we want. We can do whatever we want with that path. Now, these lines are fairly kind of boring. They're just straight, even lines. But Illustrator now lets you apply a stroke to those lines. So if we look, as you'll see, just a reminder, same workspace I was in last week. I'm in the painting workspace, but there are a few basic things we could select, and I just selected that. For example, rough brush, or we could do the same to this one. We could select something like that, and it will give you something a little bit more organic looking. And in fact, you can even, that's beyond the scope of this class, but you can create your own brushes that have properties like this or any other. And a brush can really be anything. These are just vectors that someone created. And it's just applying that long, thin vector to the length of this brush. Now, in Illustrator, there is always a little bit more than you see, and you could always access it by going to the little hamburger-shaped drop-down menu, just like the drop-down menu that a lot of websites have. So for swatches, there are a few that just sort of load automatically, but there's a whole bunch of swatch libraries. I can choose, I guess it's going out of the screen, but way down at the bottom is Open Swatch Library. I'm going to choose Art History, Impressionism, and these colors come in, and we can apply any of these colors to this stroke as well, and we get that color. So one could build up a range of colors that way. and strokes. And the same is true of brushes, and I guess this is going to go outside again too, unfortunately. I say open brush library, and I'm going to choose artistic, chalk, charcoal, pencil, but there's a whole bunch of brushes you can have access to. And let's just select this one, and it's on a super different stroke, but we can apply that to it. Now the other way you can control these lines once you've made them is you can cut them up with the eraser tool. So here's the eraser tool, and I can just draw that, and it breaks it into two. But you'll notice that the stroke changed a little bit. That's because the same brush stroke has this characteristic that it's thin at one end and gets a little bit thicker towards the other. And here you're seeing the thinness here, and it's getting a little bit thicker. So it just basically duplicated the brush and applied it to both strokes. Illustrator was not able to, sort of smartly break that brush, but it could just break it, and then we could just erase that again. And the other thing about these paths is they are all sort of come in by default, like everything else, at one point. One point is very small. They're 72 points in an inch. And this is obviously not literally 1 point. This is quite a bit thicker. If we apply the basic stroke back to it, that's quite a bit of thinner stroke. But you can still use this to control how thick those strokes are going to be. So I can move this up to 2 point if I want it thicker. Start to see some wild detail in there. Or I could even move it down to like a fraction of a point if I want it thinner. I could just say 0.5 and it gets skinnier again. So that is one way you can create marks in a little bit more of a naturalistic way in Illustrator, but the trouble is it's not super precise, and a lot of times what you want is a very specific look, and a lot of times what you want is closed paths rather than open paths. So for that, there's the pen tool. And let's switch to this document here, which I have included in students' email this week. And let's switch to the pen tool. So the pen tool is really not drawing like you would with a pen or even with a mouse or a trackpad. Really what you're doing is you're plotting how you want the shape to look with the points that we've talked about in the previous movie. So if I were to just start to draw, I'm pulling out not a line, but these two handles here. And maybe I want that, but maybe I don't. So let's start with the square, because those handles are going to give me curves every time. So what I like to say is if you can draw a heart, you can draw anything with the pen tool. And I can usually get students drawing hearts within a few minutes of learning the pen tool. What I'd suggest is after we draw each shape, you pause the movie and then you practice drawing the shape I've just created on screen a few times until you get the hang of it. So they say a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. So I'm going to start with the square. And let's just zoom in on it a little bit so we can see what we're doing better, just with my magnifying glass. And I'm going to switch back to the pen tool. And instead of dragging like I'm drawing a line, I'm just going to go to the corner, and obviously it doesn't have to be super precise for this, but somewhere. And I'm just going to click, not dragging, but just click at the corner. And then Illustrator automatically calculated the line between those 2 points for me. So when I get to this corner, I'm going to click again, and then click finally to close that shape. So that is now a closed shape. And so if you are drawing with straight line segments, you can do that fairly quickly just by finding corners and clicking on those corners. Now a circle, you need a slightly different kind of point, assuming you've paused the film and drawn out a few squares. And that one you do want to drag, because in this case you're drawing a point, but you're also drawing two handles or of those little bumps at the end. And I find it useful, or at least I did when I started out, to think of them as magnets. What those little magnets are going to do is they are going to pull the curve out in the direction of the magnet. Now, if you remember when we drew primitive shapes, we drew a square. We took the rectangle tool, and if you hold down the Shift key, you can strain the rectangle into a square, perfect square. And the same is true of the ellipse tool. You can draw any kind of ellipse, but if you hold down the Shift tool, you're going to get a perfect circle. And the same is true with these Bezier points, is if I hold my Shift tool, it is going to lock to 45 or 90 or 180 degrees. And in this case, that's what I want to do. Now, the other thing that's important is, like when we drew with the square, you want to continue in the same direction around whatever shape you're tracing. So if I went here and then I started to draw my next point, and it's giving me a little preview, it's not following it. So the direction that I drew out my handles is the direction I want to continue to go around the circle. So I'm going to come to this midway point and hold down my Shift. And by the way, if you ever have the point not exactly where you want it, you can let go of your Shift and you can hold down your space bar and move that point. So there's good. I'm going to hold down my Shift key again and then release, and then just continue going around the shape. My Shift key in this case. That's not right. Let's move that back onto the circle with my space bar. And then I can just click and finish out that curve. And there I have a circle. Now, obviously, you don't always want to draw circles, and in fact, you usually don't. And you can draw out any other kind of curvaceous shape you might want. The one thing about this is to not go too far between points, and that's something you'll develop a feel for after a while, but you can start to go, like, make these really long handles, and you can get these really kind of extreme shapes, including like little bumps like that. But that's usually what you usually don't want that. You usually want kind of like a nice kind of gentle distance between your points to get a more organic shape. Okay, so now we're going to come to the heart. And the heart has two places where we're going to draw slightly different points than we did before. The first one is the top. Well, those 2 points are the top and the bottom, where we have a curve that is going into a corner. So we want the curve to come out of the corner. So what I'm going to do is I am going to draw out my point, and this is currently a curve point just like the ones we were drawing, but I am going to hold down my Option key and pull out that handle. So I now have a corner point, but it's a corner point that's coming into a curve. So I can continue around this heart. That's just a standard curve point. That's just a standard curve point. And I get here, I want to do that again. I want this curve to go up, because you can see the contour of the curve of the heart underneath is just going up a little bit, not as extreme as the other one. So I want to do that again, holding down my Option key or my Alt key on a PC and pull that up. So I have that corner point, but with two curve handles. Then you can use like your other side of the shape as kind of a rough and ready guide for where to put your points. So I could put that there. And by the way, there's an infinite number of ways to draw this heart. You could do it with just a few points like I am, or you could do it with a lot of points. I've heard people who are really into Béziers describe the points as being almost like fingerprints. Everyone has their own sort of preferences and ways that they, places where they put the Bézier. And so then I could pull that up, and I now have my heart shape that is contouring pretty much to the heart. It's a little bit messy, but if I wanted to, I could clean it up. I can move the point to a different place on the curve. I can make these, I can edit the shape once I've drawn it to conform to the heart as closer than I want it. And that's the nice thing about Béziers, is that they are infinitely editable in addition to being infinitely expandable. You can keep working at them, and you will until they're exactly what you want them to be. Now, there's one, I would say, if you can draw a heart competently, and again, I hope you pause the video and practice drawing a heart a couple of times, then that is pretty much all you need. But there is one other type of point. It's also sort of a corner point, but it's a corner point that only has a handle on one side. So if you want it something like this, a straight line coming into a curve, and then going into a straight line, you can do that. And there are a couple of ways to control these, but I am going to start just by, as if I was drawing a regular corner point for the square, just a click. So I'm going to click this, except before releasing my hand from the mouse, I'm going to hold my Option key down, and then I can pull out just one handle for that curve. And then I'm going to hold down my Shift and Option key. I hold down my Shift key to constrain my proportions. So I move that a little bit. That looks good. And then I have sort of the opposite problem, is I'm going around the path, and I didn't want this point. Now, in fact, in reality, I could, this point is parallel to my path. It's not in an angle, so the magnet is not doing anything that's going to damage the path. It could be perfectly fine leaving it as a curve point and just ignoring that handle. But if it bothers me and I want to get rid of it, I can do what's called putting it away and just sort of returning it to that point. And if you ever lose your path, if you ever deselect it by accident, you can just click on the end point with your pen tool, and that will reselect it. So now we get back to here, and I'm going to hold my pen with my mouse down or my trackpad down, and hold down my Option or Alt key, and maybe my Shift key too, to pull out that point. Just move that a little bit. Put that home. And then I just need to click, and I have a closed path. A shape like this might be more efficiently drawn or more accurately drawn with the Pathfinder, with a couple of circles and a rectangle. But if you wanted to do it manually, or if you want something that's not quite perfect, that would be the way you could get those sorts of points. And there are other ways to achieve that, but that is a good way for starting. So I would suggest you practice at least the first 3 figures. These points are the most esoteric, but if you can draw the others, they will do. You can pretty much take on anything you want. So that moves us to the current assignment, the new assignment, and I want you to create a drawing based on another drawing of, I think I said, between 50 and 100 points. And if you incorrectly estimate or underestimate the number of points your drawing needs, it's fine. You don't have to finish it. The only goal is for you to get good at, proficient with the pen tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new document. And I'm just going to accept it as a letter size document. And there it is. So I want something I'm going to trace. So I found some old stock art on the internet. So the way I'm going to get it into this document is I am going to what's called place it. And the ellipsis tells us that we're going to see another document window in a minute. And this is taking me to my desktop, and here is the art I selected to trace. And I am just going to place it into my document. And I have here now a cursor with this art in it. And if I click it, it's just going to come in at the size it is, or whatever size it wants to be. But I may want to choose what size it is, so I'm going to instead click and drag and pull it to about that size. And this is exactly the sort of thing you might want to trace, because say you wanted the woman but you didn't want the brown cardboard background, or you wanted the woman and you wanted it to be bigger, the side of a truck or something like that, then tracing it would be a way of getting the art as a separate thing and not dependent on this brown cardboard. I think it was probably a coaster or something like that is probably why it looks the way it does. So I could start to trace it, but there's an issue with that, is if I start to trace it and I accidentally grab it and move it, it's going to be out of position with my tracing. So what I'm going to do instead, well, let's get rid of those artistic brushes now, because we're going to look at a new menu, which is called the Layers menu. And by default, every document starts with one layer, but a document can have as many layers as you want it to. And sometimes it's convenient to work with different layers. Say you're done with one part of a drawing and you don't want to see it. You don't want it to distract you from something else, or if you want to fade it out for some reason. There are a lot of things you could do with this layer. So, I mean, there's a little bit of an eye icon, so I can take it so I don't see the layer. Or I could see it again. And I can also lock this layer. And now I can't do anything to it. You see, I have the pencil tool, and it's showing me like the little no circle, like the cigarette would be inside there for no smoking. And now I just can't do anything to this layer. But I do want to lock it, but I also want to do something else to it, which is I'm going to, this is going out of screen again, for which I apologize. I'm going to go almost the way down to the bottom, and I'm going to turn this into a template just from the little hamburger menu. And so just clicking on the word template, and what that does is it fades it back a little bit, and it turns my little icon into like a little television screen or something, but I can still toggle that on and off, make it visible and invisible. But I think if I bring this art elsewhere, if it's template, it will by default not be visible in the final art. So it doesn't matter if you can see it or not. So if I grab my pen tool, I still can't draw on this layer. So what I want to do is create a new layer, and this button here is my create new layer button. And I am just going to, and if you hover on it, you'll see those words, which are unfortunately out of my recording range again, but you can just click on that, and we now see we have a new layer, and by default I'm on it, and now I am not constrained. I can draw on that layer again. So let's zoom in again so we can see what we're doing. And let's get rid of these colors. So Now, looking at this art, it was probably drawn with a brush. There's these little kind of bumpy artifacts of drawing it with a brush. And so this is probably a job for clothes pads because I want to match that shape. So I'm going to just start tracing around this. And by default in Illustrator, everything comes with a white fill until you check that. And sometimes you want that, but mostly I find it a distraction, and sometimes it even covers up what I want to be able to see underneath it. So I'm going to go to that fill, and I'm just going to switch it to none. That doesn't mean I don't ultimately want this shape to have a fill, but for the purposes of tracing it efficiently, I probably don't want it to have a fill now. And you can just work all the way around this. In this case, I'm only using just regular curve points to match that sort of brushy quality of the original. And every time I'm coming to place, I'm just pulling it out. And let's just make one more shape so we have a couple. I'll just pick her eyebrow for that. There that is. And if I wanted to, once I had this drawing done, and whether you wanted to make this part of the hair one piece with that or a separate piece, entirely up to you. They could stay separate pieces. They could be merged with Pathfinder later on. It really doesn't matter too much. It's just however you prefer working. So in the interest of time, I kept that one piece. So what I could do is I could manually take this and set the fill to black and the stroke to none. But there's another way to do that I wanted to show you that's just a little bit more efficient. What you can do is you can take your arrow tool, doesn't matter which one, either will work for this, and you can just click and drag a marquee over both pieces so that they're both selected. And we can come over here to the tools panel, and here we see my stroke color and my fill color, which happens to be none, and a flip arrow, so I can flip those two properties. And so I can just hit that arrow, and all of my pieces at once switches, and now it has a black fill and no stroke. So that is our task for next week, is to draw out a piece of art as paths. It can be something you created or something else that someone else created, doesn't matter, but it should be something like this where there's a little bit of a body. It's not just line art, but something where you're defining some shapes with what you are doing. And that is it for this video.